What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors reaches his absolute breaking point on live television? What you're about to witness is the moment Denzel Washington completely lost his composure during what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview on The Tonight Show. This isn't just another celebrity meltdown. This is a masterclass in how quickly things can spiral out of control when respect goes out the window. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below because you've never seen anything quite like this. The Tonight Show studio was buzzing with its usual energy. The familiar blue and orange backdrop gleamed under the studio lights as Jimmy Fallon adjusted his tie, flashing that trademark grin to the live audience. Tonight's guest was supposed to be a guaranteed home run, Denzel Washington, promoting his latest directorial project. What could possibly go wrong with one of the most professional actors in the business? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the legendary Denzel Washington, Jimmy announced with his characteristic enthusiasm, clapping along with the thunderous applause. Denzel walked out wearing a sharp navy suit, waving to the crowd with that composed smile that had charmed audiences for decades. He settled into the guest chair, crossing one leg over the other, looking every bit the seasoned professional he was known to be. "Denzel, welcome back to the show, man. It's always great to have you here," Jimmy beamed, leaning forward in his chair. "Good to be here, Jimmy," Denzel replied, his voice carrying that distinctive gravitas that commanded instant respect. "So, you've got this new film coming out, and I have to say the trailer looks incredible. But before we get into that, I want to talk about something that's been trending on social media." Jimmy's tone shifted slightly and something flickered across Denzel's face, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes. "Oh, social media trends," Denzel said, his smile becoming just a fraction less warm. "Always fascinating what captures people's attention these days," Jimmy chuckled, seemingly oblivious to the subtle warning in Denzel's tone. "Yeah, well, there's been this whole thing about method acting, and some people online have been saying that maybe the older generation of actors, might be a little set in their ways compared to some of the younger stars who really immerse themselves in their roles." The studio audience remained blissfully unaware of the shift in atmosphere, but those watching closely could see Denzel's posture change. His shoulders straightened and his hands, which had been casually resting on the armrests, now gripped them slightly tighter. "Set in our ways," Denzel repeated slowly, his voice maintaining its measured tone, though there was something brewing underneath. "That's an interesting phrase, Jimmy." "Oh, I don't mean you specifically," Jimmy backpedaled quickly, his laugh sounding a bit more forced now. "I'm just talking about what people are saying online. You know how it is with Twitter and all that." "No, I don't know how it is with Twitter and all that," Denzel said, uncrossing his legs and leaning forward slightly. "Why don't you enlighten me about what people are saying about actors of my generation being set in our ways?" Jimmy's smile wavered for just a moment. The audience was still with him, chuckling at what they assumed was playful banter between two entertainment professionals. But something in Denzel's voice, a steel-edged precision, suggested this wasn't going to be the lighthearted conversation Jimmy had planned. "Well, there's been some discussion about how some of the newer actors really live their roles, like they become the character completely, and maybe some of the more experienced actors rely more on, traditional techniques." Jimmy fumbled through his explanation, his hands gesturing awkwardly. Denzel sat back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, but it wasn't the warm, media-friendly smile he'd walked out with. This was something else entirely. "Traditional techniques," he said, tasting the words like they left a bitter flavor. "Jimmy, let me ask you something. How long have you been hosting this show?" Well, it's been about 10 years now," Jimmy answered, clearly confused by the direction of the conversation. 10 years? That's impressive. And in those 10 years, have you ever had formal training in interviewing? Did you go to journalism school? Study broadcast communications, perhaps? Jimmy's laugh was becoming increasingly nervous. No, I actually started in comedy and just kind of learned as I went along." "Just kind of learned as you went along," Denzel repeated, nodding thoughtfully. "So you're using traditional techniques then, experience, instinct, learning from those who came before you." The audience was starting to sense that something was different. The usual rhythm of the show, the easy back and forth that made late-night television so comfortable, was being disrupted. Jimmy tried to steer back to safer ground. "Well, sure, but we're talking about acting, which is different," he said, forcing a chuckle. "Is it different, Jimmy?" Denzel's voice had dropped to that quiet intensity that anyone who'd seen his dramatic performances would recognize. It was the calm before the storm. Because what you just described as me being set in my ways, relying on traditional techniques, that sounds an awful lot like what you do every single night on this show. Jimmy shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing briefly toward his producers off camera. I think maybe we're getting a little off track here. No, I think we're right on track, Denzel said, his voice remaining perfectly controlled, which somehow made it more intimidating than if he'd been shouting. You brought up what people on social media are saying about actors of my generation. I'd like to understand exactly what you think they mean by that. The studio had grown noticeably quieter. The audience could feel the tension, even if they couldn't quite understand what was happening. This wasn't the Denzel Washington they were used to seeing in interviews. Charming and gracious. This was something raw, more real. Look, Denzel, I really didn't mean anything by it, Jimmy said, his famous smile looking more strained by the second. It was just, a conversation starter. A conversation starter, Denzel repeated, leaning back slightly, but never breaking eye contact with Jimmy. Well, you've certainly started something. So, let's have this conversation. Tell me, Jimmy, what exactly do you think method acting is? Jimmy blinked, clearly realizing he was in deeper waters than he'd anticipated. Well, it's when actors really become the character, like they stay in character between takes and really live the role. Denzel nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. And you think that's something new, something that my generation doesn't understand? No, that's not what I'm saying, Jimmy protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Then what are you saying, Jimmy? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're suggesting that actors who came up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s somehow don't understand the craft of acting, as well as people who learned it from YouTube tutorials and TikTok videos. The audience was now completely silent. This wasn't the comfortable, predictable late-night television they'd come to expect. This was becoming something else entirely, something uncomfortably real and unscripted. Jimmy tried one more time to lighten the mood. Come on, Denzel. You know I have nothing but respect for you and your work. Denzel's smile returned, but it was sharp around the edges. Do you, Jimmy? Because respect isn't starting an interview by telling someone that social media thinks they're outdated. The tension in the studio was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jimmy Fallon's usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by the dawning realization that he had awakened something in Denzel Washington that he wasn't prepared to handle. The audience sat in stunned silence, watching two professionals navigate what was quickly becoming the most uncomfortable television moment in recent memory. Look, I think maybe we should just move on to talking about your new film, Jimmy suggested, his voice betraying just how desperate he was to escape the hole he dug for himself. Denzel tilted his head slightly, studying Jimmy with the intensity of a predator sizing up its prey. Oh, now you want to talk about my work after you've just spent the last 5 minutes questioning whether I know how to do my job. That's not what I was doing, Jimmy insisted. But even he seemed to realize how weak that sounded. Then tell me, Jimmy, what were you doing? Denzel's voice remained calm. But there was an edge to it now that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. Because from my perspective, you invited me on your show, had me sit down, and then essentially told your audience that people on social media think actors like me are has-beens who don't understand modern acting. Jimmy opened his mouth to protest, but Denzel held up a hand, and the gesture was so commanding that Jimmy actually stopped mid-sentence. Let me explain something to you about traditional techniques. Since you seem so interested in the subject, Denzel continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a master craftsman explaining his art. I've been acting professionally for over 4 decades. I've worked with Sidney Poitier. I've studied with Lloyd Richards. I've learned from the best actors and directors this industry has ever produced. The camera captured every micro-expression on Denzel's face as he spoke, and viewers could see the passion, the pride, and yes, the anger simmering just beneath his controlled exterior. When you talk about method acting like it's something Daniel Day-Lewis invented, you're showing your ignorance of the very foundation this industry is built on, Denzel said, his voice growing slightly louder. Marlon Brando was doing method acting when your parents were still in diapers. James Dean died for that craft before you were even born. Jimmy tried to interject. I know that. I never said. You never said what, Jimmy? Denzel cut him off, and for the first time in the interview, his composure cracked slightly. His voice rose just enough that everyone in the studio could feel the shift. You never said that older actors are set in their ways because that's exactly what you said. You never said that younger actors understand the craft better because that's exactly what you implied. The studio audience was now completely captivated by what was unfolding before them. This wasn't scripted late-night banter. This was raw, unfiltered human emotion playing out in real time. "I train every day, Jimmy," Denzel continued, leaning forward in his chair, his hands now gripping the armrests visibly. "Every single day, I study scripts. I research characters. I work with acting coaches. I push myself to find new depths in every role I take. But according to the social media experts you're so eager to quote, that's just traditional techniques." Jimmy's face had gone pale. He glanced desperately at his cue cards, then at the cameras, then back at Denzel, clearly realizing that nothing in his 10 years of hosting had prepared him for this moment. "Denzel, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Jimmy tried again, his voice now barely above a whisper. "Oh, there's been a misunderstanding, all right," Denzel replied, his voice dripping with controlled fury. "The misunderstanding is that you thought you could disrespect me and my entire generation of actors on national television, and I would just smile and nod and promote my movie like a good little guest." The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the crew members, usually moving around quietly during filming, had stopped what they were doing to watch this extraordinary confrontation unfold. "You want to talk about method acting, Jimmy? Let me tell you about method acting," Denzel said, standing up from his chair. The movement was so sudden and unexpected that Jimmy actually flinched. "When I was preparing for Malcolm X, I didn't just read about him. I became him. I learned Arabic. I went to Mecca. I studied the Quran. I lost weight. I changed my entire worldview to understand that man's journey. When I played Reuben Carter, I spent months with him, learning his speech patterns, his mannerisms, understanding the injustice he faced." Denzel was now standing beside his chair, his tall frame towering over the seated Jimmy, and his voice had taken on a power that commanded every person in that studio. "For training day, I spent time with real narcotics officers in the worst neighborhoods in Los Angeles. I learned how corruption seeps into a man's soul, how good intentions can be twisted into something dark and destructive. That's method acting, Jimmy. That's what my generation calls Tuesday." Jimmy looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. The confident, jovial host who had welcomed Denzel just minutes ago was nowhere to be found, replaced by a man who was clearly out of his depth. "But you know what the difference is between real method acting and what these young actors do?" Denzel asked, his voice now rising to a level that made everyone in the studio sit up straighter. "The difference is that when we're done with a scene, we know how to come back to ourselves. We don't need 6 months of therapy to remember who we are. We don't need to stay in character for 3 years and traumatize our families. We're professionals, Jimmy. We do the work. We deliver the performance, and then we go home to our real lives." The camera operators were having trouble keeping up with Denzel's movement as he paced slightly, his energy filling the entire stage. "These kids you're so impressed with. They think staying drunk for 6 months to play an alcoholic makes them dedicated. We call that a drinking problem. They think refusing to shower for weeks to play a homeless person makes them authentic. We call that poor hygiene." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience, but they died quickly as Denzel's intensity continued to build. "Real method acting is about understanding the psychology of a character, not cosplaying as them for months on end," Denzel said, his voice now booming through the studio. "It's about finding the truth in the moment, not Instagram posts about how committed you are to your craft." Jimmy finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. "I never meant to suggest that you or any other experienced actors weren't dedicated to your craft." Denzel stopped pacing and turned to face Jimmy directly, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made the host shrink back in his chair. "Then what exactly did you mean, Jimmy?" Denzel demanded, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Because I've been sitting here for the last 10 minutes listening to you backtrack and deflect. But I haven't heard you explain what you actually meant when you decided to start this interview by questioning my professionalism." The moment hung in the air like a live wire, ready to snap. Denzel Washington stood towering over Jimmy Fallon, waiting for an answer that everyone in the studio knew wasn't coming. Jimmy's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, his usual quick wit completely abandoning him when he needed it most. I was just trying to, start a conversation about different acting styles," Jimmy stammered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence of the studio. Denzel let out a laugh, but there was no humor in it. It was the kind of laugh that made everyone's skin crawl, the sound of a man who had reached the absolute limit of his patience. Different acting styles, Denzel repeated, shaking his head slowly. Jimmy, let me tell you what this really is. This is what happens when someone who's never studied acting, never trained as an actor, never spent a single day learning the craft, decides to lecture someone who's dedicated their entire life to it. The audience was transfixed. This wasn't just a celebrity meltdown. This was a masterclass in controlled fury, and they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. You sit behind that desk every night making jokes and playing games, and you think that gives you the authority to question how I do my job. Denzel's voice was building again, each word delivered with surgical precision. You think because you can read cue cards and laugh at your own jokes, you understand what it takes to truly inhabit a character. Jimmy looked desperately toward his producers, but no one was coming to save him. This was live television, and there was nowhere to hide. I've won 2 Academy Awards, Jimmy. 2. I've been nominated 6 times. I've received the Cecil B. DeMille Award, the AFI Life Achievement Award, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But sure, let's talk about what Twitter thinks about my acting techniques. Denzel was now pacing back and forth in front of Jimmy's desk, his energy so intense that it seemed to radiate through the television screens of millions of viewers watching at home. You know what your problem is, Jimmy? You've gotten so comfortable in your little bubble of softball interviews and celebrity ass-kissing that you forgot you're supposed to be a professional. You forgot that respect is earned, not assumed. Jimmy tried one more desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Denzel, please. I have enormous respect for you and your work. Everyone does. I'm sorry if I... Stop, Denzel commanded, his voice cutting through Jimmy's apology like a knife through butter. Don't you dare try to backpedal now. You said what you said. You meant what you meant. Own it. The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Camera operators were zooming in on both men's faces, capturing every moment of this extraordinary confrontation for posterity. You want to know what method acting really is? Denzel asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more power than his shouting. Method acting is finding the truth in every moment, even moments like this one. Even when you're sitting across from someone who clearly doesn't respect you or your craft. Denzel moved closer to Jimmy's desk, placing both hands on the surface and leaning forward until they were eye to eye. The truth in this moment, Jimmy, is that you screwed up. You thought you could take a cheap shot at me and my generation because you figured we'd be too polite to call you out on it. You thought wrong. Jimmy's face had gone from pale to ashen. Sweat was visible on his forehead under the studio lights, and his hands were shaking slightly as he gripped his index cards. I've been doing this longer than you've been alive, son, Denzel continued, his voice now carrying the weight of 4 decades in the entertainment industry. I've worked with directors who were making movies before your parents met. I've shared scenes with actors who defined what American cinema could be. And you think some kid with a TikTok account understands acting better than I do. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was education, a lesson in respect and professionalism being delivered by one of the greatest actors of all time. Let me tell you something about the young actors you're so impressed with, Denzel said, straightening up and crossing his arms. Half of them can't even remember their lines without looking at cue cards. They think CGI can fix bad acting. They think having followers on Instagram makes them artists. Jimmy opened his mouth to speak, but Denzel held up a finger, and the gesture was so commanding that Jimmy immediately closed it again. I'm not saying there aren't talented young actors out there, because there are. But talent without discipline is worthless. Commitment without skill is just noise. And social media followers without actual ability is just popularity, not artistry. Denzel walked back toward his chair, but didn't sit down. Instead, he stood behind it, gripping the back with both hands. You know what I was doing when I was their age? I was studying Shakespeare. I was learning from August Wilson. I was working in regional theater for pennies because I understood that mastering the craft was more important than being famous. The power in Denzel's voice was undeniable. Now, he had completely taken control of the interview, turning what was supposed to be a promotional appearance into a masterful demonstration of why he was considered one of the greatest actors of his generation. These kids, you think, are so revolutionary. They're doing things we figured out 30 years ago. The only difference is they have cameras documenting their process for social media content. Jimmy finally found the courage to speak again, though his voice was weak and uncertain. I really didn't mean to disrespect you, Denzel. I was just trying to. Trying to what? Denzel interrupted, his voice rising again. Trying to create a viral moment? Trying to get people talking about your show? Well, congratulations, Jimmy. Mission accomplished. People are definitely going to be talking about this. The studio audience began to murmur among themselves, sensing that this confrontation was reaching its climax. Here's what's going to happen, Denzel said, his voice now calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. I'm going to walk off this stage. You're going to sit there and think about what just happened, and maybe, just maybe, you'll learn something about treating your guests with the respect they deserve. Denzel moved toward the edge of the stage, then turned back to face Jimmy one final time. And Jimmy, next time you want to question someone's professionalism, make sure you understand what professionalism actually means first. With that, Denzel Washington walked off the Tonight Show stage, leaving Jimmy Fallon sitting alone at his desk, speechless, while the audience erupted in a mixture of applause, gasps, and shocked murmurs. The cameras captured Jimmy's face as he struggled to process what had just happened, his usual confident demeanor completely shattered. For several long seconds, he just sat there, the reality of the situation sinking in. We'll be right back, Jimmy finally managed to say, his voice barely audible over the chaos in the studio. And there you have it, one of the most intense confrontations in late-night television history. A moment where respect met disrespect and experience schooled ignorance in the most dramatic way possible. What did you think of Denzel's response? Was Jimmy out of line, or did Denzel overreact? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more unbelievable moments like this one.